guys absorbed those verses? Give me 2 seconds. What I'm going to do now is go back to that specific, the first verse that I showed you about allegedly slaying all the polytheists, etc., etc. And actually you find the context is again, before and after. Within that same chapter the context is absolutely clear. It's precisely the military aggression of the polytheists, of a specific group of people, actually at a historical period of time. Their breaking of the covenant, the Medina covenant, and their acts of persecution towards Muslims. The first verse of the surah alludes to this. It says, "Disavowal by God and his apostle is announced unto those who ascribe divinity to others beside God, and with whom you believers have made a covenant." Now what it's over here, it's a general thing. It's saying, okay, look, you're polytheists, we don't agree with polytheism, there's a disavowal here, polytheism is incorrect. But it's referring specifically to the covenant. Commentators such as Tabari, Baghawi, Zamakhshari, Razi, they all specify at this point that this covenant that is being brought up here is the covenant that was specifically broken by the polytheists, historically. And then the Quran itself goes on to confirm that interpretation. A couple of verses down it says, "But exempted shall be from among those who ascribe divinity to aught beside God, polytheists, with whom you have made a covenant, and who thereafter have in no wise failed to fulfill their obligation towards you, and neither have aided anyone against you. Observe your covenant with them." So it's saying this injunction about warfare is only applying to people who have actually broken the covenant, not to everyone else. And then again it says, "And if any of those who are polytheists, if they seek your protection, grant him protection, so that he might be able to hear the word of God from you, and thereupon convey him to a place where he can feel secure. This is because they may be people who do not know the truth." Nothing here about forced conversion, but we'll come back to that again. In that context, it's pretty clear that forced conversion is not the issue here. And there's another commentator, the translator of the Quran, named Muhammad Asad, who also has a commentary in this translation, who observes on this issue that where it actually says in the verse, we go back to the verse about polytheists and the fighting, etc., and it says, and if they desist, then, and if they purify themselves, and if they pay zakat, and it seems to be implying if they purify Islam. And he specifies that if you take the Quran in context again, not just one in isolation, one verse is not the whole thing. Take it in context, what it's saying is that this is one avenue that you can do. If they convert to Islam, very good, you stop. But if you go back to the wider context of the verses we've looked at again, if they incline to peace, you have to stop. It's absolutely axiomatic. So this is just one of the things. So further context, which again specifies the issue of aggression here. I'm sorry I'm labouring this point because it's very important, it's very misunderstood. Always, you go online, you Google, you find misrepresentation, selective protein. In the same chapter, how else could it be, since if they who are hostile to you were to overcome you, they would not respect any tie with you, they would not have any obligation to protect you, etc., etc. The last verse there, would you perchance fail to fight against people who have broken their solemn pledges and have done all that they could to drive the apostle away and have been the first to attack you? Again, it's again making it absolutely clear that the warfare is in the context of a response to an initial attack. So, in summary, I think I've got my notes there, I don't want to repeat the notes, so we'll go back to even wider context, labouring the point again. So returning back to this verse, that Ibn Taymiyyah says, this is the Jewish-Christian-centric verse. Fight against those who do not truly believe either in God the last day, and do not consider forbidden that which God and his apostle have forbidden, until they agree to pay the exemption tax, jizya, with a willing hand, after having been humbled. Now Asad's observation, further supported by many Quranic verses, he is the translator of the Quran that I mentioned before. He basically says, very simply, that the verse where it says, do not consider forbidden that which God and his apostle have forbidden. When you take it in context of all the verses repeatedly talking about war, and this verse then talking about conflict, it's saying that what God has forbidden here is aggressive war. The specific reference here is to the group of people who violate that particular issue. and they launch aggressive war, which has been forbidden by God. And that's supported by the verses that I mentioned below. If they seek peace, you seek peace. If they withdraw from you and fight not, then you can't fight. God does not forbid you. Again, then there's another one injunction of basically just generally being kind and just in your treatment in any scenario. So that's about the conditionalities of war. The next area of issues that we need to look at is, and we'll be closing, we'll take another 10 minutes or so and we'll close. This will be the conduct of war. Again, as we mentioned before, as I mentioned, some of the classical scholars often gave rulings which suggested that it's okay to kill civilians in the course of certain military operations because it's impossible to do otherwise, and you cannot basically fight a war in that context. But it's absolutely clear, if you just go directly to the text, that there is no textual justification for that ruling, for that interpretation. We start off with the axiomatic statement of non-violence the Quran makes clear. That violence is basically seen as reprehensible, it's fundamentally not allowed, it's prohibited. You have the two verses there which are very, very clear, very, very unequivocal. Further to this, we have multitudes of prophetic traditions, hadith, which clarify and exemplify exactly what we mean by conditionalities of war. The Prophet said, for example, do not kill any old person, any child or any woman. Do not kill the monks in monasteries. Do not kill the people who are sitting in places of worship. Do not attack a wounded person. No prisoner should be put to the sword. The companions said, reporting on what the Prophet had said to them, the Prophet has prohibited us from mutilating the corpses of the enemies and return the corpses after battle to the enemies. Even there's a respect for the treatment of the dead. The Prophet has prohibited the believers from loot and plunder. He said, do not destroy the villages and towns. Do not spoil the cultivated fields and gardens. Do not slaughter the cattle. He's also reported as saying, forbid your army from wreaking havoc. For no army wreaks havoc, but that God casts fear into their hearts. Forbid your army from purloining the booty. For surely no army defrauds, but that God will have them conquered by common foot soldiers. Forbid your army from fornication. For surely no army fornicates, but that God brings a plague on them. The connection here is interesting. The Prophet is actually saying that if you do these things, you will lose war. Your war is not only illegitimate, it will fail in the long run. And there's another quote from the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, who gave advice to Yazid ibn Abu Sufyan when he set off to Syria. And again, very lengthy, he says, when you travel, do not drive your comrades so much that they get tired on the journey. Do not be angry upon your own people. Consult them in your affairs. He's giving general advice on the general way, even the way you treat your own army. Do justice, keep them away from tyranny and oppression, because a community that engages in tyranny does not prosper, nor do they win victory over their enemies. When you become victorious, do not kill their children, old people and women. Do not go even close to their date palms, nor burn their harvests, nor cut their fruit-bearing trees. Do not break the promise once you've made it. Do not break the terms of the treaty, etc., etc., etc. Do not destroy their monasteries. It goes on, basically. You get the gist of it. These are quite clear axiomatic statements. There are no conditions on these. They're universal. There are no exceptions. Similarly with the treatment of prisoners of war, there's an independent academic analysis which I'm using here by historian Dina Salema. It's an analysis of Islam's approach to the treatment of prisoners of war. And what she does, she tries to review all the different conflicting and contradictory historical traditions about this issue. And after her review, she concludes, she looks at some of the less reliable traditions and she eliminates them, and she says, the strongest conjecture based on the available historical evidence in Muslim historiography suggests that the historical legal interpretation of the Prophet's legal practice was to treat prisoners well and not kill them.